So up until lunch, I want to just talk a little bit about, in a way, why am I emphasizing this approach? Yeah. So much, as I started off this morning, as I said, when we think about Buddhism, when we think about its practices, we associate with contemplative practices, contemplative traditions. So many of us have gone through the whole monastic thing and gone through those contemplative trainings, whether it's Tibetan or Theravada, it doesn't matter. They're all associated around that. And yet, at the heart, even of monastic practice, is a set of rules. There's a set of rules. This set of rules, I'm not going to go into detail, but the set of rules is called the Vinaya. If you're a Theravadan monk, you have 227 rules, which sounds pretty onerous, but actually they're not. The majority of the rules, the important rules, ones which are referred to in Pali as parajika, the rules from which you can get expelled from the monastic order, or the order of nuns as well, are the ones which basically align fairly well with the lay precepts. Those are the important ones. So if you kill, if you steal, if you engage in any sexual activity, if you're a monk or nun, then obviously it's an expulsion matter. But most of them are pretty well apart from that one. Rules which are gathered around etiquette, around how you are with others, what helps a community to flourish. So there's a set of ethical rules, and a set of what I call moral rules. They're all referred to as sikapadam, as rules of training. They're all rules of training. So in holding to precepts, as lay people, what we're holding to are rules of training, ways of trying to reorient ourselves in our lives. So the contemplative endeavor, what we engage in as our contemplative practice, is the sort of practice we've gone into at the moment, is both sustained by monastic rules or lay precepts, and also feeds back into them and making us more aware in the sense of how we are with others within community. And I'm going to break away from the whole monastic thing in a minute, but I just want to say this. If you think about a monastic community in traditional cultures, it's a community settled within a community. It's upheld by that community, it's supported by that community. By, in a sense, being integrated into it in a series of trusts. We trust the monastics, or they're trusted within their societies to uphold certain virtues and be exemplars of those virtues within society. So there's a form of trust. And a lot of the transgressions, which would result in you being expelled from those monastic orders, are breakages of trust between you and your community. You break the trust within your own individual monastic community, but you break the trust of those who support that community. Then, so this is really important. It took me a long time to realize this, in my own life and my own practice. When I first became involved in all this practice, I did the usual thing at my kind of age, which was I went off to India and studied with Tibetans, and I thought it was all about meditation. This is what it's about, particularly certain forms of practice and getting certain wonderful experiences and that. And as it started to sink in, this teaching, I became more and more to realize the importance of it, and particularly when in Sri Lanka, I began to realize when I started to study something called Abhidhamma. I'm not going to go into it, but something called Abhidhamma, which is an important part of the early teaching. I started to realize that ethics was really at the heart of this, but not an ethics that I'd been used to in the West. In kind of ethics that are stemming from Christo-Judaism, which is usually a list of rules which you hold. And you think, well, I've just talked about the kind of the rules, 227 of them, not 10, that monastic communities live by. But the difference is that these were training rules. They weren't completely and utterly inflexible apart from the ones that you that you would get expelled from the community for. And so I began to realize that right at the center of this practice, the heart of this practice, based on, for example, metta, karuna, that sort of sense of friendliness, goodwill, not loving kindness. Please stay away from the translation loving kindness. It does not mean, metta does not mean loving kindness. It means friendliness. It means, basically goodwill towards others. At the heart of it was that. That's about community. That's about practice. That's about being with each other in a different way. So is compassion. But equally, these reflected back on the individual. It wasn't just a giving of compassion or a giving of metta, as a basic, if you like, virtue that we engage in. It was also something that reflected back on the individual. In engaging in compassion and engaging in metta, there was something that came back and nurtured and in some senses expanded the sense of who we were as human beings. This was actually to regain our humanity. I don't know if it's ever occurred to you that our humanity in some ways is a very fragile thing. It's a very fragile thing. And what really, really encouraged me in the early days, particularly when I was involved in this practice, was that what we got was a picture of somebody, i.e. the Buddha. Remember, it's an epithet. It's not the name of a person. It's an epithet. One who is woken up, which is really what the word Buddha means. One who's woken up. What we get is a picture of somebody who's not, in a way, godlike, but somebody who is actually showing how human beings can really exist. That was the exemplar that was being held up here. Somebody who had woken up to what it really means to be human and what that potentiality holds and how easily we can let it go, how easily it can slip. You have these mythologies within the whole traditional Buddhism, which talks about 6 realms of existence. Only one of them is human. And it's not really talking about, traditional Buddhism takes them as being real, but also there's a psychological interpretation which is there within the Abhidhamma, which is these are, in the senses, states of mind that we can inhabit, godlike states, animal-like states, states of completely beating ourselves up continuously, which are like hell realms, etc., etc. I won't go into this. But humanity, the kind of sense of being human, was just a very small element of this. So it was about the potentiality to be really human, not in its worst sense, but in its most, its greatest potential. What is its greatest potential that we have to be in this world? And I began to realize, of course, that this was the heart of the practice. It's how we were with each other, in community, how we were also with the world that we live in. Do we hold this world that we live in reverence, or do we despoil it? Do we exploit it? Equally, do I hold you in some kind of respect and reverence, or do I abuse you? These are often the choices that we have in this world, and these are ethical choices. They're choices that we find ourselves in daily, I would say, We have choices, about how we approach another, be with another, how we be with the world that we live in. And we have, in a sense, a question always: how are we going to behave in these situations? How am I going to, just in that face-to-face situation, how am I going to behave with you? Particularly if, in some ways you're irritating me. Come on, these are the situations we all find ourselves in. We find ourselves being irritated by people. We find ourselves not necessarily liking them. Sometimes we can find, that there's attraction there, etc., etc. All of the kind of human situations that we find ourselves in when we're in that face-to-face situation with somebody. But there's always the question of how are we going to behave with that person? What are we going to say to them? How are we going to treat them? I could extend this into the bigger world, but let's just talk about the human realm for the moment, the human world for the moment. So it's a real question for us. I hope you see that. It's not an easily answerable question. It's a task. It's something that we're always moving towards. So as you will know, traditional Buddhism, the Buddhism of the Eightfold Path, has a little section in it which is usually hived off and called sila. What does it deal with? It deals with speech, it deals with action, and it deals with livelihood. Pretty important areas of our life, aren't they? Speech, action, and livelihood. I'm not saying these are not in relationship with other factors of the Eightfold Path, but these are generally taken as being the key aspects of sila, this ethical, moral sense that we're developing within the path. Speech. As human beings, I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but we're immersed in language. We're always speaking. Well, I feel like I'm always speaking. But we're always speaking. We're never not speaking. There's a German philosopher who once said, human beings speak constantly. We're constantly speaking when we're silent, we're speaking when we're reading, we're speaking even when we're asleep. We're always speaking. We're such linguistic beings. I find it really interesting that the Buddha puts, in this traditional list, speech in there at the kind of top. In other words, in contemporary parlance, because I said, this is ethics for the contemporary world. This is, this is about, not just about speech, but it's about communication. What passes for appropriate communication? The Pali for this is samavacha. Samavacha. Sama is usually translated as right. I hesitate with that translation. It's more like what is appropriate as a form of speech. How do we appropriately, or let's translate it into modern terms, how do I appropriately communicate with you? And I think in the modern world, this would include all of our digital communication as well. Any way in which, in scare quotes, we speak to each other. Is that speech helpful or harmful? We look around the contemporary world. I'm making my own judgment here. I'll let you make your own judgments, but I'll just say it very briefly. I feel there's a huge amount of damage that's done through our modes of communication. So it's an issue for us, how we communicate in our emails, in our texts, in our social media, how we literally contact each other in these face-to-face situations. So this is not just abstract. This is real stuff of ordinary life. What am I going to do when I sit down with my keyboard, and how am I going to communicate with a wider public or with you as an individual? What am I going to say? Because this is another form of doing. It's an action. It creates, all of these create our livelihoods, our actions, and our speech, all of them create, which is something which is in Pali known as vipaka, a fruit, a consequence. There's always a consequence to what you do. Often there's a confusion that goes on between two terms. One is action and the other is speech, is the fruit of that. And the word that gets confused, I'll give the Sanskrit version of it because it's more commonly known, which is the word karma. The word karma is interpreted often as a great metaphysical thing. It isn't, it's just action. So in the Pali, it's samakamanta. You know, it's that which gives rise to a consequence. So anything you do, anything you say, anything you engage in has a consequence. Yeah. And the interesting thing is you cannot always predict what the consequences are going to be. Yeah. So awareness is absolutely vital in our daily activities, in our ordinariness, not in our extraordinariness of being on retreat, although it's very important, and not being in special situations, but the ordinariness of the general everydayness of existence. Yeah. How do I communicate? How do I act? Yeah. So rather than trying to give you lots of answers today, what I want to try and do with you is kind of generate why this is important as something we investigate. Yeah. Something that's really important in a whole list that's called the Bhujangas, the Sapta Bhujanga, which is actually the 7 factors of awakening. One of those is called Dhammavicaya, which means investigation of phenomena. Yeah. Sounds pretty dry, but it isn't. It's actually investigation of the ways that you exist and what is occurring to you. Yeah. So one of our primary areas of investigation are these 3 factors. Yeah. And particularly with regards to consequences of speech, of action, and of livelihood. Yeah. There's not a lot of detail, interestingly enough, given in the early text. I mean, for example, speech. Well, let's just list out the traditional ways of talking about speech here. The first is, of course, is that it's not lying. Yeah, right speech, or as I'm saying, appropriate speech, is not deception, is not lying. That's one of the first aspects, the most obvious one. And so often, for example, the lay precept is interpreted as simply don't lie. But it actually implies more than that. It implies much, much more than that, because it implies also what else should I refrain from that wouldn't constitute this sense of communicating properly, communicating adequately, communicating appropriately in any situation. And this might include also divisive speech, speech that tries to break communities, split them apart. We see this. You see this in workplace situations, where there's kind of factions speaking against each other. You see this in political parties, you see this in communities, wherever you go, you see human beings engaging in divisiveness. You also see them engaging in speaking very harshly about each other. How I speak about another is very reflective often of my own inner world. And speaking harshly, I, in a sense, divide the world up. And finally, interestingly enough, there's gossip. Which actually in the Pali more translates as idle chatter. So when we start to speak about speech, when we think about communication, well, we have to look at, in a sense, a criterion, investigate. Does it fall into, in a way, trying to mislead people about something? It can be an out and outright lie, which we might know from our politics these days, or it might be simply that little embellishment you give to a story to make it a little funnier. Is that a means of deception? Yeah. Or does, even our ability to create a fiction show us something? Human beings, we're storytellers, aren't we? A lot of those stories are not true, but they show something. They demonstrate something. They illuminate an aspect of human experience in their fiction. So again, it's not saying simply don't lie. It's saying look at that whole, what are you trying to do with that? Are you trying to deliberately mislead, or are you trying to actually illuminate something? So taken very harshly, you would say that actually right communication or right speech wouldn't entail fictive stories, because fiction is not true by its very nature. Yet there's another intention, isn't there, behind it? So one looks at the intention behind that mode of speech, that mode of communicating. Equally, when we come to the other forms of speech, what are you doing in those other? So what is the intention behind those other forms of speech, those other forms of communication, those other forms of languaging that we use? And the interesting one I always think is idle chatter. What is idle chatter doing, or gossip doing? I actually prefer idle chatter. It's actually, I don't know if you know about sort of when an engine is, when you're sitting in the queue and it's idling, and your engine of your car is just chuntering over and it's not doing anything and it's not going anywhere. It's just switched on. That's idling. So this kind of language that's not really doing anything. It's not communicating anything. It's not actually involved with, getting anywhere, showing anything, illuminating anything. And so idle chatter, if we think about it, is it always idle? Because I can think of my days in universities when I often had to interview students, and I might just ask them some simple questions, which might be, how's your day? How are you feeling? What was your journey like? Things like this, which might be seen as sort of frivolous, idle, but they were trying to relax somebody, to make them feel more at ease in those situations. And so, again, it's looking at the context and that's why I prefer this translation of appropriate. What is appropriate? So fiction in one context might be inappropriate if it's a downright story that you're telling somebody to mislead them. And yet in another context, that fiction might be illuminating something. That idle chatter might be idle if I'm literally just gossiping and passing on bits of information, which is going nowhere. Or it might be useful and appropriate if I'm trying to put somebody at their ease. So what I'm trying to give you a picture of is that the kind of ethics that we're talking about in terms of Buddhist ethics and in our everyday lives is, in a sense, slightly difficult because it's always contextually bound. It's always down to where you find yourself in the context. So in one context, something might be appropriate. In another context, it might not be appropriate. So when we start to think about what we're trying to do, if we're following this path ethically, is we're trying in a way to awaken that sense of awareness, which will allow us, in a sense, to touch in with those contexts that we find ourselves, those situations that we find ourselves in, a lot more quickly. And hopefully speak more appropriately, act more appropriately, in the context of our wider sense of our lives, live more appropriately in the way that we, for example, engage in a livelihood. And this is just one particular domain, a really, really important domain of what early Buddhists and later Buddhists come to that regard as sila, as this whole ethics morality issue. So we always find ourselves in a context. We always find ourselves in a situation. You're never not in a situation. Being in a situation, I would say, and I think the early text would confirm this, that we're always, in a sense, involved in something ethical, because everything that I'm going to say, everything that I'm going to do, if it's with others and if it's with the world that I live in, has an ethical consequence. It has that karma and vipaka at the end of it. So I do something, I say something, and it has a consequence in that world. This is why it's important. And when we engage in this meditative process, as I try to make clear in the sort of introductory remarks I made this morning, when we engage in the meditative process, the cultivation process, the cultivation of a greater awareness, the cultivation of a greater sensitivity towards being and being in the world, then I'm developing an ethical sensibility. I'm awakening that ethical, if you like, sensitiveness, of being able to look more closely at what I'm doing and what I'm engaging and the consequences of what I'm doing and what I'm engaging in. This is why it's so important. This is the heart, along, I can only give you a very brief introduction today of all of this, but this is the heart of what this practice is about. So it's not getting super transcendent experiences, although some aspects of Buddhism speaks about it. It's actually about how to ground ourselves in the actual world we live in. Even the notion of nibbana, which is the kind of summum bonum of Buddhism, the goal that which it's all directed at, certainly in early Buddhism, is more a sense of disentangling from reactivity. This is what it means. The word nibbana can be translated many, many different ways, but it's a sense of reactivity having gone out, if that makes sense. That there is a fire of reactivity. Greed, aversion, and what fuels that greed and aversion, the ignorance, delusion, confusion is my favored term here, in a way has gone out. Now that sounds very negative, because all we're talking about here is some very negative idea, the idea that what we're aiming at is the extinction of something. Early commentators on Buddhism back in the 19th century viewed it as that, but Buddhism was about extinction. That was the goal of it. It was about the extinction of certain qualities, and those qualities were the greed, aversion, and delusion. Those are what goes out, those fires that sustain what I call our ordinary, usual existence, that doesn't reach its potential for us as human beings, is driven by those factors. When those have gone out, it sounds like a negativity, but something else has happened. Something else has grown as a sensibility. What has grown is the opposites of those. When the Tibetans came to translate Buddhist terms into Tibetan, the word that they translated Buddha as was as Sangye in Tibetan. And the word Sangye, if you literally translate it, means everything negative has been eliminated and everything positive has grown. That's literally what it means. Everything negative has gone, everything positive is present. That's what a Buddha meant for early Tibetans when they were translating this material into Tibetan. And what I think that's really indicating is something very important within this process, which is when we speak about, if you like, the ethical goal of Buddhism being, or the final goal of Buddhism being, this sense of nibbana, or nibbana-ing, this is a verb form, then what we're aiming at actually is not just an extinction, but the growth of something else. And the growth of that something else is the ethical qualities with which I engage in the world. So instead of greed, I engage in generosity, not just generosity with stuff, or money or anything like that. It's generosity of the spirit of being in the world. Instead of aversion, what has grown is this capacity that everybody possesses for friendliness and compassion. And the compassion grows out of the friendliness. So out of metta grows karuna, and other qualities as well. And instead of the confusion, there's deep, profound understanding that's grown about the way our actions actually impact on others and the world, but also an understanding of the way the world in a way unfolds for us. Not in a scientific mode, but in a way of just understanding how it unfolds for us on a day-to-day basis, such as impermanence. So even in that final term, we have it not as an empty sense of, something just has been eliminated, but something else has been grown. Notice I'm using that cultivation word again. Something else has been grown. So we want a metaphor just to finish off before we go off to lunch. If I have a metaphor, I might look out my garden and see lots and lots of stuff I don't want, and I just eliminate it all, get rid of it all. But there's nothing else in the garden. That's not nibbana. Nibbana is actually growing something else. So you eliminate what you don't want, or is not necessary, and you grow something else in its place. So in ethical psychology in Buddhism, basically the psychological dimensions are divided into two aspects, kusala and akusala. So in the Abhidhamma psychology of early Buddhism, you will find two big lists. One which is akusala, which is actually that which is unhelpful, unskillful, unwholesome, if you want to use that word. And the other, which is also has another epithet which is attached to it, which are called sobana in Pali, which means beautiful. These are the beautiful aspects of your psychology to be cultivated. And they include things like generosity or non-greed, non-aversion, non-hatred, etc., etc. You've got a long list of these. And they far outweigh, believe it or not, the negative psychology in early Buddhism. And that psychology is actually an ethical psychology. It's nothing else. It's saying what, in a sense, is to be dropped through the cultivation of something else. Because when I'm cultivating, for example, ethical qualities in this world, ethical qualities of engagement, I cannot be cultivating at the same time they're opposite. So if I'm trying to cultivate understanding, I can't be cultivating confusion. If I'm cultivating non-greed, or generosity, I can't be cultivating greed at the same time. So it's an ethical psychology. So at the very heart, it's a question of ethics, and I'll say more about that later on today, to close the day, basically.